All right, welcome everybody to The Changing World, a conversation on climate change as part of Words, this fantastic literary festival that we have access to here in London. So I want to say welcome to everybody in the audience today. Thank you so much for coming out. I know it's looking a little bit bleak this morning, but now the weather is absolutely lovely. And welcome to everybody online as well. We're so excited to have you here. What we're really looking for is a great conversation today. And what we're bringing to you today is a multidisciplinary panel about climate change. And what multidisciplinary means is that we're looking at climate change not just from engineering, but we're looking at from geography, from Indigenous knowledge, from arts and humanities, from different aspects of engineering. What does this mean for who we are as people, and how can we work together to really progress and deal with climate change? And literally what we want to do today is bridge those divides. And that's the theme of this year's Words, is bridging those divides, is finding a way that we can all come together as humanity to change what's coming ahead of us. So, and it's all about bridging the divides between academia. We're here at Conron Hall at University College on the beautiful Western campus, but making sure that the knowledge that we're working on here is accessible to you, and bridging those divides as well. So before I get started, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Chungtong nations on lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. With this, I respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit endure in Canada. And we accept responsibility as a public institution to contribute towards revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service. As a child of immigrants, I have benefited by being born on these lands, educated on Indigenous lands, where 3 generations of my family have thrived. I am committed to honoring the true history of this land and Indigenous peoples. I'm committed to supporting and amplifying Indigenous voices, knowledge, and research. So I'll start with explaining who I am. So my name is Tristan Joseph. I'm the Manager of Communications for Research at the university, which is why I'm really excited to bring you this panel today. So I wanted to just start with a couple of questions for our audience here, but if you're online, please share as well. So how many of you are from Western today? All right, so a lot of our audience, about 50%. How many of you are not from Western? All right, so congratulations. Thank you so much, that's exciting. All right, here's a quick question. I'm just gonna get you to put your hands up as we go. According to climate scientists, what is the maximum global temperature increase that our planet can sustain? So put your hand up when you think you've got the right answer. So is it 1 degree above pre-industrial levels? Is it 1.5 degrees? All right, so we've got a few people, but that's the maximum we can sustain. 2.0 degrees above pre-industrial levels. We got a couple people here. 2.5 degrees above, right? So we got pre-industrial levels. 3.0 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Got a few here. How many of you just don't know? All right, got people here, so across the board. So the actual answer, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels is the maximum global temperature that our planet can sustain. But 1.5 is preferable. Past 2, on average, will cause unprecedented changes across the globe. And we're starting to see what those changes are now. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. So first, we have Gregory Kopp. So Gregory Kopp is next to me. Gregory is the Impact WX Chair in Severe Storms Engineering, lead researcher in the Northern Tornadoes Project, and a professor in Western University's Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. His expertise and research relate to mitigating damage to structures during extreme windstorms such as tornadoes and hurricanes. He works actively to implement research findings into practice, currently serving as the chair of the ASCE 49 Standards Committee on wind tunnel testing for buildings and other structures, and as a member of various other building code committees. A former Canada Research Chair in Wind Engineering, he's also the lead researcher for the Three Little Pigs project at the Insurance Research Lab for Better Homes. Thank you so much for being here, Craig.
Thank you.
And I have Lewis. So Lewis Williams is an interdisciplinary Indigenous feminist scholar and practitioner of Maori and Gaelic descent. Her scholarship and practice center on Indigenous resurgence and reconciliation as a key means of addressing Indigenous disparities and human planetary well-being. She's the author of the recently released book, Indigenous-Led Intergenerational Resilience, Confronting Cultural and Ecological Crisis, published by Routledge as part of its Indigenous Peoples and Policy series. Previously, she was the lead editor for the book, Radical Human Ecology, Intercultural and Indigenous Approaches, also published by Routledge. She's an associate professor of Indigenous Studies and Geography and Environmental Studies at Western University, and is also the founding director for the Alliance for Intergenerational Resilience, a Canadian-based not-for-profit. Lewis's work is very much about building cultural, generational, and interdisciplinary bridges to address pressing global issues. Thank you so much for being here, Lewis.
Kia ora, nice to be here.
So next on my list is Gurva. So Gurva Bitsemalak serves as the director for the Windy Research Institute and the research facilities, which includes the Dome, which you haven't seen is pretty cool, the Boundary Layer Wind Tunnel, which is located on the Western campus, and Three Little Pigs at Western site leader for the SharkNet Computing Center, which I'm sure we'll get into discussions of that too. His research expertise is in climate resilient to sustainable buildings and neighborhoods. His research utilizes a combination of computational fluid dynamics-based simulations, which is assisted by artificial intelligence, and uses high-performance computing and physical experiments at the Windy research facilities. He's executed wind-induced load and response studies for socially and historically significant super tall buildings, such as the Freedom Tower in New York, the International Commerce Center in Hong Kong, and the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. He's an expert in both in experimental and computational wind engineering. Thank you so much for being here today, Gurva.
Thank you.
And really excited also to have Joshua Schuster, who's the Associate Professor of English and core faculty member of the Center for the Study of Theory and Criticism at Western University. His book, The Ecology of Modernism, American Environments and Avant-Garde Poetics, won the Alana Bondar Memorial Book Prize. He has over 24 essays in journals and books on topics of poetry, environmental ideas, and philosophy. He is also the co-author of Calamity Theory, 3 Critiques of Existential Risk. His newest book, What is Extinction, examines several key moments that have come to define the terms of extinction over the past 2 centuries, exploring instances of animal and human finitude and the cultural forms used to document and interpret these events. He's a member and treasurer for the Association for Literature, Environment, and Culture in Canada. Thank you so much for being here today, Joshua.
Glad to be here.
Wonderful. So I'm just going to get started now that you hopefully have a good idea of everyone that we have on stage today here. So what is your vision of how we understand climate change and what that means for our future? I think everyone's looking at you, Greg.
All right, it's probably going down the row, right? Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. My work isn't so much on climate change, but on the impacts of climate and severe weather on our built environment and the natural environment. And so for me, when I think about climate change, I think about adaptation and what we need to do to start to mitigate the effects of changes in the weather patterns as a society. There's a lot of challenges with that. I work a lot with building codes because to make houses safer, we all live in houses, and that's where we go in the storm. In the pandemic, we spent a lot of time in our houses, and they need to be safe. And so we work on building code changes for that. And I run pretty quickly into issues of how do you change culture and how do you change the way we do things. As an engineer, I can make an economic and life safety case for making stronger houses, but if we don't adopt them, that's to me where the questions arise. And so I'm really pleased to be here as part of this panel because these are the kind of issues I'm quite interested in.
Thank you so much. Lewis, what does that mean to you? How we understand climate change and how we can impact the future? Yeah, go for it.
Nami mahala ke koto koutoa, koutoa mai nei, ke tēnei kōrero e te rānei, ko mātou te waka, ko mawo te maunga, ko tauranga te moana, ko nā te rangi te iwi, ko te awanui te moana, ko o te pāpaka, ko te pāpaka o, ko Lewis Williams aho. That way of introducing myself is related to what I'm going to say, by the way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about cultural change, just linking in to what you were saying, Greg. So that was a pepeha. So that was a Māori way of introducing myself on the Polynesian part of my ancestry. And part of what I want to talk about is a shift back into Indigenous ways of relationality, a cultural shift. And looking back, I think we have to unravel the ball of wool a bit. And for me, what's created climate crisis is colonialism and runaway capitalism. And long story short, all people were Indigenous to place once. And we've all been colonised, some more radically than others. And so I think we have to combine coming back to deep ways of relationality and interconnectedness in with modern technology and the things that we have available, the technology that we have available now to carry us forward. So it's a quick answer, yeah. But.
Okay. Just my opinion is dictated by buildings, the way how we design buildings. At the center of everything, people are there, like our body temperature should be maintained at 37 degrees centigrade, Any swing in any direction by 10 degrees centigrade, it will be the end of it, Then whatever we do as building engineers revolves around climate, Like it starts with people. Today, everyone came with heavy jacket, winter clothes and things like that. Why? Just look out through the window. There was snow, We respond to the climate. Maybe we were enjoying few days of warm weather, even in November, So continuously we respond to a climate, If you see a Miami person coming on the thick of London winter, walking with a short, what do you think? You think that person is crazy, right? And the same thing, you go to Miami Beach and you walk with a Canadian jacket, everybody will look at you, So when you look at buildings, and you see them the same in Miami and London or Montreal, there is something wrong, Buildings are the ones that moderate the climate to keep human beings in their comfort zone, When Tristan asks how much is a critical change in temperature, it was only 2 degrees centigrade, We are talking about small swing, So for me, climate change is like whatever we design for, how it changes and how it will impact the way we design things and the way we do the living, Lewis mentioned about indigenous knowledge. Actually, when you look at the indigenous knowledge, specifically I don't pretend to know about it, but I'm originally from Ethiopia, one of the oldest nations in the world as well. There is similarity. And also, broadly, when you look at vernacular architecture, at the center of the design process was climate. Everything was climate responsive. But when resources were abundant, we forgot. We designed with very weak building skin, and to cope up with that, what do? We pump a lot of energy. As a result, now buildings worldwide consume 40% of the total energy we produce. 40% of all the energy production is consumed by buildings, And if we do our job properly, the way our ancestors did, design buildings in a climate responsive manner, 80% of this energy consumption could go away just through proper climate responsive sustainable design. So what does that mean? Just knowing the climate properly. Of course, when I look at Greg, for example, he chases tornado to understand, he uses the environment as his living lab, and we go also together in the lab and we produce tornado, hurricane, different kind of climate system, and we study at a model level. Where I'm heading with that is the interaction between climate and building is so complex. We have to go to the field really to understand, When I say this, people question to me, we have been building houses, homes for the last so many thousand years, and we don't know how to design for climate. Perhaps, yes, we don't, And then the technology is helping us to unravel. So we need the field measurement, we need the lab experiment, and the technology that we see in terms of computational and everything is allowing us to handle the problem in its complexity. That way we fine tune and get the right design. When you look at our biology, for example, human beings, we have the most delicate but the most efficient system, how our skin responds to the climate, how we sweat, how our hair stands, It looks like we have a delicate system, but maybe we are designed properly, So we need to do something like that, In our buildings, we need to pay attention. And again, I will emphasize, Greg mentioned, Lewis mentioned it, at the center of it is people, The science is only one aspect of it, We do the science. If you don't communicate it properly with the people, the decision makers, the public, then it is only half cooked, We need to work with communication experts and also use different type of, mind you, when I think of people, the way they conceive information, whatever fits to the screen, whatever can be written beautifully on the screen, whatever that can be simulated in a way that's understandable, only those are useful, Then we have a lot of job to do to bring such a complex thing into that, Then for that we need people like Joshua, for example,
Okay, well, thank you. As everyone's talking about buildings here, I can't help but look around me and look at this very fascinating building, which maybe I hope it has been designed in a way that has climate in mind. And I'm glad to have everyone here. I know the acoustics are not ideal, but hopefully you're able to hear all the back and forth of us. So I'll just quickly describe what I do is in the humanities. I teach environmental literature. I use literature to think about the environment, and I use the environment to think about literature. I'm not the first to do this. So many people do it. In fact, building on what Gurma just said, if buildings have always been about the climate for thousands of years, same with literature. So it doesn't matter what you're reading, there's going to be something about climate.
Sorry,
Okay, back to. Okay, well, anyways, so the thing that I want to say on the humanities side is that so climate change and the environmental change is not just going to be a technological or scientific question. It is going to be a cultural or humanistic transition as well. So if we're thinking about transitional energies, we also need to think about transitional cultures. And what will that be? What will be our mindset? We might say after oil or in the next 50 years, how will we think differently? And that's, I think, something that everyone can participate in. But the biggest fear I have is that we might have some helpful transitions to more renewable energies. So we might be able to electrify everything, have some better buildings, but maybe little else will change. And if that's the case, I think we've done it wrong. And in fact, I don't think we will be out of the crisis of climate change. I think it will go on. So I'll just relate really quickly a model I use when I'm teaching or when I'm writing and researching. And I think about the difference between ecological content and ecological form. And for me, ecological content is infrastructure stuff. So again, electrification, or maybe bicycles, or better buildings, or non-renewable fuels, or more gardens. So all that is content or infrastructure. But form, ecological form, I think about it as how we relate to each other, how we share, what are the ideas and communities that we build, how do we interact on a daily basis, where does our sense of imagination come from, our sense of critique as well. And it's not as easy to identify what ecological form is or environmental form is. But again, I think if we do a transition where we just have content or infrastructure, it won't work and it won't be far enough. We have to also change at the level of form, how we relate, as Lewis was saying, and how we practice decolonization and moving on from capitalism and from extractivism. And again, I think we will need both a shift in content and form.
So I'm just going to ask you guys a quick question, because what I've heard across all of them is that we kind of forgot the laws of our place. Either we've moved on from where we were, so my heritage would be back in India, so I don't know the laws of that place. But I'm also transplanted here without a long history, so I don't really know the laws of this place. What does that mean for us throughout, in every respect, in terms of how we understand the climate, how we live in the climate as humans, how we built things? What does that mean when we don't understand the laws of the place, and how can we get back to that?
So yeah, good question. That's pretty fundamental. So I've actually been physically on the rohe of the territory of Deshkanzibi for 1 year now, and I don't feel like I've got very far in learning the laws of this place. And it's something I feel very strongly about. I cycle past the Deshkanzibi every day. But that's fundamental. So I've done some learning of the laws of the land that I'm from, Aotearoa, and finding ways to observe the patterns of nature. And my ancestor, a good story. I was just also thinking about what you were saying, Gurma, about how our bodies is self-regulating, but they're very finely attuned, right, to do what they need to do with the climate or whatever's going on. I think most of us, and we let our bodies go on autopilot, right? And we go along. But we have the capacity to be finely attuned to place and to really know in our beings the laws of the land and how things work, how the environment works. So some of my Polynesian ancestors were great ocean goers and sailed many, many miles across the Pacific to get to Aotearoa, New Zealand. And they carried with them the knowledge of where they had come from, right? And it wasn't until they got to Aotearoa, what became Aotearoa, right? And through very intimate observation of the patterns of the sea, the moon, the stars, the land, for their own survival, right? That is actually how Mataranga Māori, or Māori knowledge, was birthed. And to get there, to travel these vast tracts of ocean, right, they were reliant on the stars, the whetū. They were reliant on the sun. They were reliant on the winds. They were reliant on the currents. And when all else failed, so when there was no wind, by day, say, when the stars weren't available and they were becalmed, right, one of the techniques was to lie in the bottom of the waka, to lie in the bottom of the canoe and to sense into the currents, right, to try and find their way. So that attunement, that's a human capacity that we all have, except we're so much in our rational, in our minds, nothing wrong with rationality, but we have whole bodies and whole beings, and we really need to make an effort to learn the laws of the environment and the way things work right where we are. And that is where Indigenous legal law comes in. So I can say some more later about what I've learned through Rongoa Māori medicine in terms of learning the laws of the land and different practices for that. But for me, it's really fundamental. That's the first, because as you said, if we just go with technology, right, and we don't actually, I think, get a cultural shift back to these deeper ways of relationality, and Western cultures had those as well before they were colonised. So I think we've got to really combine these different ways. And for me, the laws of the land, the place, form that foundation.
If I may add to that, actually, that's a beautiful discussion. For me, nature is an open university. Just open your eye widely and learn. As a scientist, what I try to do is use the technology to explain why things work. When I look at vernacular architecture, or how indigenous people in their community, like the igloo house and everything, how it works, then the technology usually comes to explain the physics of it. Why is it working? Why this is efficient than the other. Then when you merge the science with nature, what we learn from nature, I think that's the most sustainable way, in my opinion. And there is a strong relationship, again, I'm repeating myself perhaps, between climate and the way we build houses, for example. I got a chance to be educated in 3 different continents and perhaps work in 4 different continents. I see the different architecture. Then if you look deeper into the culture of every society, the way they build is in response to the climate. You go to Cairo, you see thick wall, high ceiling houses. Why? Because of thermal massing. The day is hot, the evening is cold. Then they use a thick wall to delay the heat from coming to the house. Then that thick wall will be cooked the whole day, and when the night is cold, it becomes a source of comfort heat. You go to the Midwest, North Carolina, a very light construction with big bungalow and things like that. Just when you look at everything we do, actually it is a response to climate. And it's that one is changing on us. If you look Montreal, during winter, it is a fascinating city. I went to school, I did my PhD in Montreal. A strong wind storm will come, and just in a couple of hours, you feel as if there was no storm. We are well wired to cope up with a cold climate. But a slightest swing on the positive side, what happened in 2018? People die because of heat wave in Canada. Can you believe? And that same heat, when you look at Delhi or Addis Ababa, nothing happens. Why? Because we are ready for the cold, but we are not ready for the hot climate, a slightest swing. Why? Cold climate dictates airtight construction, you control the air and everything, In hot, you need to have some sort of ventilation and things like that. So as Greg was saying, we need to identify, mind you, this is from sustainable perspective. Again, from the existence of the safety of the building perspective, that's also another issue, like the global warming, for example, is steering the hurricanes northerly, and are we ready for that, What's that we learn from our ancestors, the way they build, and help it with technology and make a construction, a living style that is commensurate, that is consistent with nature, that doesn't affect the environment significantly. I think that's a goal.
That's okay. I can go on to the next question if you could. Nope.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do that.
I can bridge both of you.
Good. Okay. So what is research telling us about climate change? And I'm not just, yes, we know there's certain degrees of increase, but what's it telling us about, what are we starting to learn in research through the severe weather research that we do, through the literature research that we do? What is it telling us? What do we as humans need to absorb and learn based on the research that you're doing?
Okay, well, all right, I'll bridge those two questions. And when you asked that first question, it really made me think about the role of education and the role of Western University. I think about, why did they decide to build right here? Were they thinking about the relationship to the river? Not much, but now it's there, and that's such a wonderful teacher for all of us, the Deshkan Zivi. And but to be able to sort of understand those teachings, we have to learn how to interact, converse with a river or with a tree. So in particular, there's the tree on this hill, that big apple tree that's in usually all the pictures of this university. And I think about how that tree has seen everyone graduate. Like for about 100 years, it's about 100 years old, and it's seen all these students graduate. The stories that tree has are amazing. All you just have to do is ask it. And it'll tell you the stories. You're going to need, this is always my pitch, because, well, you might need some humanities tools, your writing skills, a little personification, a little, of your interview skills, and the tree will and the river, they will tell these stories. But I don't, it doesn't have to be that tree. It could be the tree in your backyard. It could be the food you buy in wherever you shop, because those have stories too. And I think the better we are at reading those stories or listening or sharing those stories, that's part of this transitional culture that I have in mind. I mean, it's going to take creative work. It's going to take, we certainly need to know what the stories of this particular area and the indigenous longstanding stories, and think about those who have cared for those stories over and over. It's not just the stories themselves, but the storytellers. And so, and it involves all of us. We all are part of those stories.
Awesome.
I feel like there's a disconnect. So as humans, we've been very, very good at finding new ways to grow food, for example, and that's been a great success of humanity. We have now billions of people are being fed, and it's because of things we've done. We've learned how the world works and how crops work and genetics work, and we can create and grow a lot of food. On the downside of that, we now have lost that connection to the earth because we have large-scale industrial farming. When you ask what is our connection to the land as an engineer, I'm going to say, well, almost none. And this goes to how we educate our students. I remember very few things from my first year of engineering school, but the one thing I remember is the first course in thermodynamics, and we have this concept of the infinite reservoir. So we do things in the world, and we dump it into this infinite reservoir, and we make the fundamental assumption that nothing is changing. And of course, that's wrong, and as we've gotten larger, so we have this to me, the disconnect is we have the technology, but it also has a downside. And now we're paying for that, and we haven't paid for it fully along the way. And so how do we bridge that? When Gurma talks about 40% of our energy being in houses, but 80% of that is wasted, I don't know how we get there to actually reduce that consumption. I mean, there's massive cultural changes that need to happen and the way we act. And Lewis was talking about capitalism and things. As an engineer, I participate in the capitalist system because I design things for our world. And so how do we bridge those disconnects between that if we're going to actually move forward? I don't have answers.
That's okay. That's okay, because I think what we want today is discussion, right? So actually, I'm going to skip to the next question because I think this situates us well, is what do we need to learn from Indigenous knowledge systems? What would, as an engineer, what do you want to know? As someone in arts and humanities, as trying to find our sense of place in London, Ontario, and in Canada, what is it that we need to know in order to adapt to climate change?
Well, I actually want to talk a bit more to the last question.
Please do.
If that's all right.
I'm just moderating. This is your show. There. Go for it. Love it.
So my research, so I'm not a person who researches the climate statistics. Every now and again I do, right? But my from what I can see and tell, I have a lot of privileges that protect me, but I can see that, all the signs are that climate, catastrophe and climate change it's here and it's now. And my anecdotal research in the classroom, when I'm working with younger people, often 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, tells me, and that, we are at a time where we are being challenged. We have to adapt in some very deep ways, and it's more or less it's like dig where you stand, right? And that's kind of the metaphor. And my anecdotal research tells me that the students do not need any more accumulation of facts, data. Data is important. I'm not saying the science isn't important, but underneath that, fundamentally, I think spirituality is really lacking in our education systems. Now, let me tell you just very simply, in this context, what I mean by spirituality. I mean the kind of teaching and opportunities for learning where students are able to integrate what they're learning into their own centres, into their own experiences, and build some strengths to go out from there into that space of what I call creative agency. So for me, we're living in a time we've had all the traumas of colonialism. The traumas of colonialism are still with all of us, even if you think you don't feel them. And I could unpack that later. But I think on top of that, we have a superordinate level of trauma, which is around all this uncertainty in our changing climate. And I could connect that to a lot of other dots. And so in terms of what's not right with our world, missing and murdered Indigenous women, two-spirited people, the precarious work and the importation of workers across borders, that's a lot to do with a broken system. And so my anecdotal research tells me we really need, in terms of that cultural shift, we need to bring spirituality a lot more. That what's available to me at the moment, well, it's academia. We need to bring spirituality a lot more into academia and be establishing with students those fundamental platforms for integrating the knowledge into wisdom so that there's some sense of agency there. That's kind of what I see.
Joshua, I thought you had something there. So actually what I'd like to, what I think that sort of leads into, it feels like the world's a little bit unfamiliar, right? I mean, I think growing up, you know, winters used to be pretty steady, summers used to be pretty steady. The way that we interacted in our world seemed to, we had a status quo, it seemed, at least when we're young, we see the status quo. As we start to grow up, what does that mean for us when we're always, you know, the heat changes? In Canada, we were taught we have a temperate climate. It feels intemperate sometimes. What does that mean for us? How do we deal with that? How do we deal with that scientifically, spiritually, philosophically? All the changes. We everything around us, we can't really ever take it for granted. It was 20 degrees just about a week ago. It's been snowing for the last day. How do we make sense of all of this?
For me, I see so many things, you know, like, for example, climate change problems are multidisciplinary in nature, you know, like by way of handling complex things in a convenient way, we have created different silos, you know, like when you look at engineering, engineering is broken into many things, you know, then you have science, you have humanity and things like that, you know, but when you step outside the university and identify one problem, everything is interconnected, you know. Then we need to start handling the way we see it in nature, you know. Luckily, the technology is helping us, you know. Now you can go to a field and collect whatever amount of data in a more convenient way, supported by drone and things like that from scientific data perspective. And in using computers, for example, helped with AI, we don't have to even simplify things, you know, the way they are, we can model them, you know, we can understand, you know. Then kind of creating that barrier, you know. This barrier I'm talking about is not only academic barrier, working with our community closely, you know, like we are in London, right? London is our living lab, you know, working, bringing the university closer to the community in so many different ways. And at least we will learn how we convey the research outcome so that it's useful, implemented, you know, in our municipalities, in our city corridors by the developers and things like that, you know. When we look at the built environment, I agree there are fundamental challenges, you know. One, it is not a manufactured process. It is trade-based, human-intensive process, you know. By design, we don't want one building to be the same with the other, you know. Then even the design parameters are complex, you know. Imagine when you want to design one Toyota Corolla, thousands of engineers with billions and millions of dollars, they optimize that one design and they copycat, you know, they just manufacture the same thing, you know. With building, it's not like that, you know. We have to reflect the culture, the habit of, it revolves with human being closely. So we have to bring the behavior aspect, the social aspect, the nature stressor aspect in its entirety. That way we may bring good solution, you know. Thank you.
I'm really curious. Actually, I'll say something, but I have a question back maybe for our engineers, which is, what do you think of the trend to build all these tall buildings, especially in Toronto? The massive amount of construction, do you feel that the lessons are being learned? I mean, we know density is a good thing actually environmentally, but are these buildings built to last? Do they have the lessons that you have in mind? But maybe before that, I'll just say I totally agree with what Lewis is saying as well, that I think the students and people in everyday life know the issues. They know that they feel the climate, and everyone is going through this huge crisis. We're all going through it together. We're not sure what to do on a daily basis. I always say, you know, it doesn't, you know, you can start anywhere. You start anywhere in the day. And that's a great place to start. And it's not about being powerless, but it's just about I wrote a book about issues around how do you think about catastrophe and big scale catastrophe issues, and why would the humanities be involved? It's usually more like, again, infrastructure thinking. But one of my conclusions was that you have to build in whatever methods you're going to use to think and talk and deal with massive catastrophes. You have to build in systems of care and consultation and creativity with everybody, where everyone feels like they're participating. If you do that, it's resilient. It'll survive. If you skip that step, then when the catastrophe hits, then it's much worse and may not rebound. So if people are storing stories, memories, passing them on to their friends or the next generation, that makes the world more resilient. I even want to say, reading a book is the most radical thing you could do. And it's climate revolutionary to read a book because it's low impact, and it shifts your mind from an accumulative sense to a reflective sense. It shifts, you notice things around you more. And that's the massive change, but it wasn't that hard to do. So it doesn't even matter what book you're reading; it'll have that effect on you. So, anyways, that's my encouragement for now. But I am curious about the building thing.
Well, density is good. My concern would be when there's a monoculture. So to minimize cost, when we look at suburban neighborhoods or in downtown Toronto on the old rail lands where they're all huge condos, the skyline has changed a lot since I lived there 30 years ago. It's completely different. And we tend to do these things with monocultures. But I think there's a growing awareness in the design community, at least, and Germa was touching on that we have to be diverse. The new neighborhoods, they have ponds in them. They're completely manufactured ponds, but that's a natural system that helps with flooding, right? And makes us more resilient. What we have to do is not get rid of all the natural systems that are already there, but work with them. And that locality becomes quite important. So diversity is a critical aspect. And I think we can have optimism that the world is moving in that direction, but we're not there yet. A lot to be done.
Yes, Joshua, actually, I'll try to respond to your question with the story you told us, When you talk about the tree, I was very impressed, actually, If you were to ask the tree, you said, I would relate it to building, If you were to ask that building, where each material came from, how it was built, where the wood came, where the brick, and how much energy each steel consumed and things like that, you will clearly know what not to do and what to do, I think like your kind of story questioning, we call it in engineering life cycle cost analysis, like we literally ask, where is this material coming? How much energy it used to reach that place, Then when you really rationally ask questions like that, it leads you back to the way we were building houses in our ancestors, For example, mass timber building, like if you see typical Canadian house, it was made of wood, We have forest, even just to maintain the forest, you have to remove the tree. That tree is sufficient even to build the house that we need, Then there is a beautiful movement, like now we can, Ontario removed the height limitation for building up to 12-story using wood, Yes, people question about fire and things like that. There is a research that supports that you can make even wood fire resistant. And there is wind issue. It is light, it will vibrate when it is too high. We have a technology to control that, So literally the concept of, questioning, writing the story of a building will tell you like building with local material, with natural material like trees and things like that. And it is possible to do that, Yes, I repeat what Craig said, density is good. And mind you, if you have scattered house, it's not only the house you have to think, the plumbing system, the water system, the energy system, you are duplicating, when you have things clustered, it will be efficient, good for the environment as well. But I like the story of questioning the tree. If we question everything we do, the answer is there.
So yeah. So I just want to. So my mind's just going back to diversity. So I think in the world where we have, in many ways, we're good at doing diversity. With the globalization of culture, but we're not good at doing equity. And so I think that's a key issue in terms of climate change, science and strategy. But I'm also going to link this to Indigenous knowledge and law a bit. So there's a Haudenosaunee story, probably many of you will be familiar. This is not my cultural story, but I know it enough to tell it humbly here. The story of Sky Woman. So Sky Woman, and according to this Haudenosaunee creation story, drops through a hole in the sky, comes down, she's pregnant, and there's just vast ocean below. She's falling, and the beings of the ocean looking up and they're seeing this strange form coming towards them. And then suddenly a flock of birds or geese, I think it is, they come and they start to gently guide Sky Woman down, and then she lands on Turtle's back. But there is no soil. A little bit of soil is needed to start to form the world. And so the beings that are available each offer to dive down into the depths of the ocean to see if they can bring some sand or some soil, something up. So the larger beings among them try, and I can't remember which ones they are, but I know that I think otter does, I think beaver does, and none of them are successful. And then finally, the muskrat tries, and muskrat dives deep, and after long, they think he's gone, and then after a long time, he finally emerges. There's this little clump of sand and soil, puts it on Turtle's back, and then with his last exhausted effort, muskrat dies. But that little bit of soil is enough, right, for the world, Sky Woman, to start to create the world. One of the teachings of the story in terms of climate justice is that it was so-called the littlest ones, muskrat, who no one thought would have a hope to be able to do this. It was muskrat who brought that soil up. And I think this is a profound teaching in terms of climate justice and equity, that it's really important to listen to what we think, who we think are the smallest of voices, or to bring the marginal voices in, because sometimes they are the most powerful, and sometimes that is where the creative agency is found. And I would say that with climate justice, in terms of how we're approaching climate crisis, science and strategy. Now, there's nothing wrong with rational empiricism or what we think of as Western science, right? But we also need other sciences, and the social sciences. We need women's perspectives, we need Indigenous women's perspectives, we need two-spirited people's perspectives, we need the economically marginalised perspectives. We need to bring everyone into this circle, right? And that is actually flipping the script, because our script has become, in terms of colonialism and capitalism, one that's hierarchical. And that's the real cancerous pattern that has allowed the extractivism of the earth and human extraction as well to build these vast empires. So in that simple Haudenosaunee teaching, I think it's really important to remember the power of the muskrat, or those who we think are most vulnerable and marginalised, and whose voices often don't enter science and strategy. And Indigenous ways of knowing and being, they are a science, right? And just one more thing I'll add, there is rational empiricism, but there is also radical empiricism, what we know through our dreams and our intuitions. And this is these can be, they can be rigorously examined and explored, and so can these stories for their teachings. So that was all sparked by diversity. Yeah.
So I hate to have to do this, but I'm going to ask our last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to everybody here and everybody online to ask us some questions. You've got 4 awesome researchers here, so start thinking of those questions. You can type them in if you're on Zoom, and if you're here, just raise your hand. But the last question I'm going to ask is, what book would you recommend people go home and read?
Aside from our accomplished authors, I'm going to say Catherine Hayhoe has been an inspiration to me as a climate scientist, and she had a book in 2021 called Save Us, and it talks about how we should be optimistic and how we can talk to people, not to change their minds, but to help them come from their own perspectives to an understanding of what's happening in the world.
Awesome.
I'm still thinking.
The book I recommend is a book written by an architect. It's called Heating, Cooling, and Lighting. It's not about HVAC, it's about how you design the building so that you don't need the HVAC actually, and it's called a sustainable building design strategy. I know it looks like very scientific, but it's written by an architect with beautiful illustration. There is no calculation or something, but a discussion of concept, how buildings are designed to be climate responsive. It's by Norbert Lechner. Actually, when 12 years ago, now I came to Western, I created a course, Sustainable Building Design. Literally, I took that book and populated it with physics, computer modeling, and things like that. The simplest course, but the most impactful course I taught. It literally changed the way young people think about their built environment. The integration aspect. Paying attention to nature. How we design things in harmony with nature. You will achieve the same comfort, the same luxury, but in a more sustainable way. And that's and you can read it anytime. Usually some books you have to read them in the morning. This, even when you are tired, you can read it. It will catch your attention. Thank you.
Well, I'll just, before I forget, give my book recommendations, which English professors are always asked to do that. It's fine. But I would add, though, that I love reading science books, and I love that our library, I mentioned this when we were chatting before, but our library at Western University is an incredible collection, because the faculty over generations would just donate their books, and sometimes you open the book and they're doctors and scientists who have donated like a lot of our literature books. So this university has had a long history of scientists and humanists reading each other's books, and I hope it continues. And I'm very thankful for that. Well, I'll just quickly mention 2 books that I really like. They're both graphic novels, or graphic written. First is called Here by Richard McGuire, and it is a book that is like, it's one place in North America seen through kind of like a window of any particular year, and it's not linear. It jumps back and forth in time, and a lot of it is in the 1950s, then suddenly it'll go into the 1500s, and then suddenly it'll go into 2000 or 3000 years later, and then it'll go a million years backwards. It's just that one little spot in North America, and it's very beautiful. It actually, I think, has a very powerful emotional response with very few words. And it's a little expensive, unfortunately, but it's a great to share with other readers. And I would actually recommend pairing it with one other book, if I could add, which is, it's called Our Place, 150 Years. It's multiply authored, so it's hard to look up in that way, but it's by Indigenous authors in Canada. And it is also a graphic novel, and it has a similar kind of structure, and it's looking at different stories from an Indigenous sort of graphic novel perspective, some in the future, some in the past, some in the present.
Awesome.
Okay, I thought of it. Soil and Soul. I think it's Soil and Soul by Alistair McIntosh. And so it sort of links into the revitalisation of Gaelic culture in Scotland, but it's also very much about land reform and land back, and talking about, that climate's important, but our resilience is also rooted in the land. And I think it's also powerful because it conveys that, indigeneity is not about a colour, it's about a practice. So I think that's really important as well. So it's obviously soil, earth, but it's soulful as well. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys. It could be a question that's based on something that you've heard today. It could be a question on something that you've been thinking about. What are the questions that you have for our researchers today? Yes, in the middle there.
Some mics.
It seems there's a bunch of people that are involved with buildings. I'm wondering why there isn't more buildings that sort of standardize roof pitches for solar use or passive solar buildings that are kind of required, as we're obviously going to be seeing a lot more subdivisions that are kind of monoculture buildings. Why isn't that something that is a rule that would actually encourage more of these buildings? I think there's less pride subdivision that it's done something of that nature to try and encourage the entire subdivision of solar. But it seems like there's all these buildings that are regular peaks and valleys we could retrofit later on. Why aren't we trying to do better?
Perfect. So I'm going to repeat that back for everybody at home, and correct me if I'm wrong. But your question is, we have all these subdivisions, but we're not consistently building things with solar panels, for instance. And why aren't we doing that on a consistent basis? Is that correct?
Yeah, just the design for the
just design for this. Yeah. Perfect. All right.
Well, buildings, especially houses, are built to the building code, and building codes, I think, kind of by definition, look backwards. They embody the way we've historically built. In Ontario, I think we have very good building codes, and we've moved towards having buildings that are net zero. And so there's been a lot of work to not waste the energy that's in there. And so the insulation requirements have gone up, and the quality of that. So that's a real positive. For houses in our climate to be truly net zero, they need to have solar panels on them, as you point out. I don't think we want every neighborhood to look the same. I think of that movie, Edward Scissorhands, if you remember that. And they drive around the neighborhood and they all look the same. I find that creepy. So I don't think from an architectural point of view, that's what we want. But I think the direction the building industry is going is towards that. And there's some advanced builders. One that we work with, Doug Terry in St. Thomas, makes beautiful net zero ready homes. They come with, you can put a few solar panels on them and then they are net zero. And he's also added features to make them resilient to the climate. So as the climate's also changing, the way we have to build needs to change too. So the nature of storms and things. And so bringing resilience in. So all the cost of the insulation and those things don't end up in landfill when we have a bad storm.
Yeah. To add to what Greg said, actually the question is excellent question. Mind you, when I refer to 40% of the total energy we produce in the world, in Canada, 30% of the energy is consumed by building. It's primarily to be used for space heating and cooling. It's not even for lighting. What it means is it's the most crude, simple form of energy that could be harvested from solar, as you indicated, and that's missing primarily from the way we build houses, and with net zero building, you mentioned the S2E or West 5 construction, luckily Western was part of that process. We need those kind of construction. I want to give them credit, and the beautiful thing about this, in addition to reducing mitigation, why one of the reasons why climate change is being is aggravated is because there's a lot of greenhouse emission. And again, more than 30% of the greenhouse emission is contributed by building. In the way we heat our spaces, and mind you, I'll refer back to what I said earlier. Our goal is to make people comfortable, and our body temperature needs to be maintained at 37, but everything we do is heat generating system, and we have the closing and everything, and the comfort temperature is around 22, 23 inside our home, Then you can imagine what's the temperature throughout the year in Canada. It is off 22, Then all that balance is done through the energy we bring to the building, Then our nuclear reactor called sun provides us for free, The way we design things really needs to change significantly. And the good thing, the net zero movement, the different policies that's coming is encouraging us to do, but we really need to do more, Whenever I'm asked this question, I went to give a talk in one of the universities in Jerusalem, and one day I opened my door, of the hotel. What I saw was thermal system, in every building, they don't use electricity to warm, Here, we produce a higher form of energy called electricity, and we use it for heating, the lower form of energy, So we need to do a better job. The reason, because energy was sufficiently available, it was cheap, nobody was asking, we were pumping. But now, the side effect of that practice is changing the climate. Now we have to rethink, We have to think holistically what we are doing, Thank you.
Wonderful. Oh, lots of questions. Love it. I'll go to you here. Yeah, with the green shirt, yes. And then, oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So I wanted to hear from the panelists their opinion about the fact that we live in a finite world, right? I think oftentimes in discussions around climate change and planetary issues, they lack that topic, that important. Because we can talk about technologies that are going to make our future more sustainable. We can talk about Tesla, we can talk about wind turbines, we can talk about solar panels, but we still live in a finite world. And I think, saying that if we do X, Y, and Z, we're going to be more sustainable, we're just passing the hot potato around and not really tackling the root cause. So I wanted to hear your opinion about the panelists today about this.
Perfect. Great question. So I'm just going to repeat that for everybody online. So the question is, the one thing that we haven't talked about today and that we need to have a bigger discussion is we live in a finite world. So we have finite resources. So, what do our panelists think? We talk about sustainability, but is that just sort of passing the hot potato? I'm not sure if that was the term, sort of down the road when really it's a finite world we live in.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And one of the things that I was thinking about on my way here is our patterns of, particularly in the West, where we think we can, is our patterns of addiction. And addiction to things, addiction to commodities, we all of us, most of us, I think, have really quite deeply addictive patterns. And we, and that ranges, you see the full gamut where people just want to leave the space mentally, and so there's drug addiction, right? But that goes right through to the things that we consume. So I think that's actually partly a spiritual question, because I think the more that we can turn inward, right, and know the nourishment of the inner space and the nourishment of relationships, I think we've really got to move away from addictions to relationships. And was in class the other day, was at the COP27, one of my students, they were doing a bit of browsing, and they saw that one of the the catch cries was like something like $1 trillion opportunity for the fashion industry, or something through renewables. But this idea of growing and growing and growing the economy, for what? If it's a different type of economics where we can be in relationship with our other than human relatives, and our human relatives much better, and there's equitable sharing. But yeah, I think that really has to come very much into it, and we've got to shift from our addictive patterns. I think they're so deep and they're so cancerous in our society. Yeah.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
So from an engineering point of view, Gurma talked earlier about life cycle design, so keeping track of everything that we do in design and designing things so that they can be reused, taken apart when it's done and used in a different way. But I think there's other things too, and this gets beyond technology policy, government policy, and our economic models. All our economic systems based on continuous growth, and it doesn't take into account the finite resources. And so we need work in those areas. We need research in those areas to develop different policy options for us. I get kind of alarmed, and I guess we're going to get political now, when we lower the gas tax in the province. And I don't understand why that is, because I don't think we're paying the true cost of a liter of gasoline at what's $1.65 today. I don't think that's the true cost. And if we think about it as a finite resource, you can put a better cost to it, and then we can that will affect our decision making. And so I think we need those policy kind of options as well.
Well, just to add on to some of these reflections, from my understanding, even there's not enough minerals on the earth to build solar panels for everybody, and there's not enough to build electric cars. So even if we electrify everything, it's still not it's just not there. And then how equitable will that build out be? If capitalism is going to sort of take the lead, it's going to be buyer gets it first. So where do we start? I would add, of course, you sort of probably know my system of argument here. I think solar energy is key in terms of panels. What about solar cultures? What will that be like? If you just get the panel and then don't talk to anybody, that's not a change, right? You need a solar culture in which the solar panel is linked to things about environmental justice. Where did the minerals come from? Were they consulted, and were they benefiting? And what social practices and conversations can we have around whatever we would call a solar culture, and it would be a more spiritually informed basis. I mean, for me, I just like to, every time the sun comes out, I just like to sit and that's it. That's good enough for me. But I know, the reason why I think it's terrifying to say that there's not enough minerals. So what do we do? I mean, degrowth, yes, but I also think it's encouraging in a strange way, because it means we have so much to imagine, so much to think about, and so much to talk about, and we're all involved. So it's, we have both at the same time, and how do you do that together? That's the key.
Awesome. And so, we've got a question right here.
So you talked a lot about how cultural change has happened in order to address climate change, and cultural change can take decades, not centuries, to happen. Additionally, existing well-known infrastructure don't have cultural change in mind when they think about the future. They're much more interested in technological solutions that reinforce the existing power infrastructures. So how can we accelerate cultural change so that we can address climate change without getting into the same problems that technology has gotten us into?
So I'll repeat that for everybody online. So how do we accelerate cultural change, acknowledging that in the past, the changes that have happened at a technological level have benefited us in a more capitalistic way? But how do we ensure that we don't repeat the same mistakes of the past? Is that sort of an accurate-ish?
I kind of have two quick responses, and probably I mean, my two quick responses. In terms of accelerating cultural change, one of the things, I don't know if anyone here listened to the John Burrows talk the other night. No, okay, so he's an Anishinaabe lawyer. And he was talking about integrating, as an example, integrating Anishinaabe law with Western law, right? And I think that's a huge cultural change because the changes are at a structural level. And he talked about, in terms of, if you think about social innovation, one of the things that, and kind of finding those catalyst points, one of the things that John talked about, the analogy was he was in the kitchen baking with his mother and watching, and she would put bits of yeast into the bread, right, and watch that bread rise. And he made the analogy, not everyone needs to know Indigenous law, in that deep level, but you need a few change agents, right, who know that deeply, yep. And so I think. And we're talking about, huge power. I mean, things have continued because of the power structures, right? Because of the corporate power structures, the government power structures, who are in positions of power, which cultures they represent, all of those, the unconscious habits of mind. So that's my key thing in terms of putting that's the analogy. The other thing is that I'm afraid I quite sincerely believe is that we have to ready ourselves, I think, because of human nature, and humans by nature do not seem to give up power very easily. And so I think one of the things that we do have to ready ourselves for is for a certain amount of collapse, so that we can get some change. And I think that's one of the things, when I think about younger people like yourself, and what are the kind of the skills and attributes, because I think it's about what fundamentally in terms of limited growth, and it's about not only what will be taken up, but what has to be given up. Yeah, so I don't have a straightforward answer for you. I'm trying to figure it out myself. There's two quick things that come to mind. Yeah.
Just to acknowledge, by the way, that's complex question, Even I always struggle and I don't know the answer to that, One thing on a personal level that has worked, just educate, Like whenever I think, I design my curriculum organically to respond, For example, I created sustainable building design, just to respond to what I see, Like if everyone responds in their capacity to educate, particularly with our children, K-12. My son is more responsive to recycling than I am, because I'm not used to it, Now, when I try to use plastic in the grocery, he will just look at me and he reminds me, okay, then I go for the paper option and things like that, So teaching maybe our children's, maybe to be honest, it's a complex process that we have to in a multidisciplinary way figure out. That's what I'm hoping, for example, for humanities, from behavioral scientists to tell us, what's that we can do,
I think it's a really vital question. I think we all actually carried that question. I've just decided I think I'm going to carry that question for a bit. How do we accelerate change? I think that's really critical.
Joshua, did you have something you wanted to add there?
Yes, I mean, it's not really a humanities perspective on it, but I just think, I also think one of the most climate revolutionary things we do is bicycle. When you're on that bicycle, I mean, you're well aware of the price of gas and how everything is designed around the car. And it's very much infrastructure. You think infrastructure all the time, buildings, and it's hard in Canada. And it's not, so it's certainly not easy. But I fantasize about, like, everyone should be given a bicycle, like, in the world. There should be a universal bicycle donor program. But then I've also seen photographs of it. There was a wonderful art project from someone in China who they sort of tried to do that there, and it sort of was company based and it didn't work. And then all those companies went bankrupt, and then there was like 1 million bicycles just thrown into the garbage. So it was really powerful image of thinking about the whole story of the bicycle. But anyways, there was even one article I remember reading, a person who said, everything I think about that I want change, it can be fixed by just being on a bicycle, right? It brings health, spirituality, knowledge, nature, mobility, and yet there's obvious limitations to it too. But anyways, it's just a first thought.
Perfect. So I have time for one more question, and we're going to go to online.
So these are two questions that come from online on the webinar, and both have to do with listening versus speaking for nature. So the first one is the question draws a distinction between using our technological advancements to understand nature versus using them to speak for nature. And the comment remarks, listening to nature is the trickiest hurdle that we face. How can we become better listeners to nature and to its spirits as opposed to speakers? And the second question relates to that, which is how can we be good listeners to smaller groups than to corporations? So listening versus speaking.
Do I need to reply that? Yeah, so just to repeat that for our online audience, and great question. For two questions is one, how do we become better listeners to nature rather than speaking for nature? And how do we become better listeners to smaller groups that have ideas and thoughts to contribute?
Well, I'm going to jump in. I was listening to a podcast last night. It was Jill Lepore, has this podcast called The Last Archive. She's a New Yorker staff writer and historian. And she was looking at the 50th anniversary of Earth Day and looking at a question of if we had something different happen in the early 70s when even Richard Nixon was supporting the environmental movement, probably to get votes, right? But there was some constitutional amendments in the U.S. that would give rights to nature, that the environment had to be considered. And we have rights for corporations that treat them like people in the system. And I think if we had something like that, so a policy direction that forces us to do that, that would be a way of doing it. So coming back to the structure of our society on something like that, it would be my response.
I see we're doing all the talking. Okay, so just a couple of quick responses. So like in New Zealand, the Wanganui River was accorded personhood. Yeah, and so there's been other similar movements. In Indigenous societies, in Te Ao Māori, Māori society, the role of humans is to express the consciousness of Papatūānuku, of Mother Earth, right? So that was, and because of that deep listening to nature, then actually, there's the survival of my ancestors depended on that, on listening deeply and expressing the consciousness. And so that's not the kind of listening we do when we're reading a book or listening to I don't know, the radio or something. That's that really embodied deep listening and observing patterns. And one way that I've been trying to teach myself to do that, because I grew up apart from my tribal roots. I grew up in a Western education system. Has actually been through learning. I think there are many ways we can do this, but the one channel I've found is through learning rongo Māori, which is Māori ways of medicine, and learning about the land medicines and the medicine that the land can give us. So, for example, just e.g., if I go to do some harvesting, I learned that I've got to actually watch the cycle of the moons and see which I would never harvest when there's when there's no moon. I need to harvest at a time when the sun is right, when I know the sap is going to be rising in the tree, but not too much that it's going to damage it. I need to observe the moisture around the tree. So I think, etc. And so I think the more specific practices that there are gateways that we can find to cultivate those deeper listening capacities that we all have. So that would just be my quick response to how can we become, because it almost becomes a mystery. It's like, what? How do I do this? I wasn't taught to do this, and so I think if we can find those kind of channels, or learn to weave, or whatever the practices are around Deshkanzivi, some of those ways that don't put pressure on Indigenous people, but but there are ways you can go to medicine workshops, for example. The other thing, it certainly is possible to speak. You don't need words to speak to a mountain or to listen to a mountain, or to speak to a tree. Those shamanic ways have been part of every society.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. So again, I hate to do it, but it's 3:30. I think we've had a wonderful discussion. I want to say thank you so much to everybody here for giving us your time today, everybody online as well. We really appreciate and are grateful for all of your time and your thoughts. I would encourage you all to read the books that were recommended today, continue discussions. Don't just take what you learned today and sort of lock it away. Share it with one other person. Read books, be political. In a way that feels right for you. I'll just do a quick shout out. There's a London Climate Leaders Networking event on Tuesday, November 15th, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. So that's another great way that you can interact with leaders in the community. But even just by reading a book or having a conversation, I'll take out the word just, because it's not just. Those are really important acts that you can take to move things forward. So thank you all so much. I really appreciate your time today.